Before we get started, I'm just going to share a link. If anyone doesn't know, here at How Now, we recently published a boot camp called What the Fluff. It's a six-part self-paced course to help you build a winning L&D strategy, everything from diagnosing problems that need solving, planning out your strategy, involving the right people, scaling it with marketing, measuring the feedback, everything in between. So I'm going to drop a link for that in the chat, and you can sign up completely free today. Cool. I think we're ready to get going. So Srishti, if you're ready, we will make a start.
Yes, let's do
Perfect.
it.
Cool. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Srishti, for joining us. And I'm really excited to hear your advice around context-driven L&D. But to give people some context to who you are, just tell us a little bit about what you do and your background and what it is that you're doing in the L&D space.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm Srishti. I'm a learning experience designer based in Bangalore here in India. And over the last decade or so that I've been working in learning, I've donned many hats. I've donned the hat of a researcher. I've donned the hat of a strategist. I've donned the hat of a designer, amongst many others, and tried to dabble with everything from toys to systems to strategies across the board. So that's just a little bit context about the kind of work that I do.
Perfect. You mentioned the word context, which is the nice segue for me, because I want you to tell people about the importance of context for building effective learning experiences.
Yeah. So I think there's a quote that kind of sticks with me a lot, which is designing for everyone is designing for no one, right? And I think that in a sense kind of sums up why I keep stressing on the word context, right? And I think as anybody that's working in learning, it's very easy to kind of get into content very quickly and get into the what and the how. So we're building an online course on XYZ, or we're building a MOOC or a self-paced course on something, right? And what we end up then struggling with more often than not is kind of engagement or retention. And that's because we are starting from the wrong place. We're starting with the what and the how rather than the who and the why. And that's really where context comes in, right? My co-founder says one thing which I keep saying again and again: anything that is contextless is kind of meaningless, right? And context has to come before content does. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, I think the context in any space, marketing, sales, anytime you miss out context, you are getting off on the wrong foot because you can't create stuff that resonates with people. So I really like that as well. I'm going to share a great LinkedIn post from you, and I would recommend people follow you on LinkedIn anyway in the chat. That is kind of the inspiration for this chat. But you've got this really interesting three-component part of how you build a context-driven learning experience. So tell us about those three parts and how people can involve all of them.
Yeah. So the three parts, and I mean, it's easier to visualize this in the form of like concentric circles. You have the learner, which is sort of at the core. You have the institute or the organization, which is kind of the second layer. And the third layer is the ecosystem, right? So the learner is really about trying to understand who's the experience for, who's the end like beneficiary, what are their needs, what are their wants, what are they looking for, essentially. The organization or the institute, which is kind of the second layer, is what in a lot of times determines what the learner's behavior is as well. So what motivates them, what are incentives that are at play, what is the hierarchy? A lot of that influences what at the core the learner will end up doing. So that's kind of what the second layer is about. And the third layer is essentially the ecosystem, which is looking at what are trends in that specific topic or space. How has this evolved over time, right? And by understanding all these three different layers is when you truly get a sense of the context. So another way to look at it is kind of there is some part which is bottoms up, which is understanding of the learner and the organization or the institute, and the ecosystem is where the top down comes in. And we need both of those to be able to truly make sense of the space that we're working in.
Yeah, I've put the link to the article in the chat, and it has these questions to ask to find this kind of context. But one of the ones around learners really interesting. You talk about how you can understand what motivates them, what their day looks like, how much time do they realistically have. is this part of it as well, just understanding the context of how much time people have to dedicate, what's a personal connection for them, what problems are they actually facing in their day-to-day where you can have the most impact, and then kind of using that as a starting point?
Yeah, I mean it's also if I design a full-time course for people that are working, like it's bound to fail, right? So for me, understanding of that context and time is one factor. There are many other kind of levers that as learning experience designers we work with that becomes really integral. And a deeper understanding of who our learners are at the end of the day will really help us design better experiences for them.
And I'm going to pick up another question from that section because I really find these interesting. But you ask about what are the patterns of behaviors that we're seeing across our learners. That's really interesting because I see when people try and build personas, I think they get stuck into a persona of someone like made up that exists outside of their company. But I really like this idea of trying to spot commonalities across people in your company, or, really building a persona of what are the learners in our company. So any thoughts on how people can approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are multiple ways to do that, but actually going and talking to your learners is what will help build those. And I think if you look at the user research world, they sort of differentiate between what personas are and what archetypes are. Archetypes are largely based on behaviors, and personas are more demographic. And I often feel like we kind of get stuck with just the demographic. So if somebody is a 20-year-old learner versus a 40-year-old learner, we feel like they will behave differently, but often you'll find that behaviors cut across ages, cut across those demographics, and it's about truly uncovering those. And you can only do that by actually interacting with them. So having like conversations with them where you have specific questions that you're trying to understand their lives, also beyond the work that they're doing, is really important. But also like other interactive ways to kind of maybe do a card sorting exercise or other activities can be done to kind of make that interaction a lot more meaningful, and you can take away a lot more about the learners themselves.
Yeah, so much of this resonates with someone told me a while ago to focus on pain points more than personas. And I feel like this process that people can check out in the blog post that I've shared will really help them get to that idea of like solve for pain as opposed to necessarily a persona, because I personally think you have more impact that way. By this point, we know about the context, we know why it matters, we know these three layers. How do we then take that context and transfer it to our learning experiences? And what are some of the tools or advice for people to do that?
Yeah, I think first it's about getting everybody on the same page. Oftentimes what happens is we're looking at, different parts of the elephant. So somebody's just looking at the tail, somebody's looking at the eye, and that cartoon that exists. So it's often that, and internally within the team, we're not aligned on who are we designing for and why are we trying to solve this problem, right? So I think the first step is trying to make whatever that understanding is a lot more visible. And in the article, there are some frameworks that I have used quite often across different kinds of projects to kind of do that. But needless to say that there are so many other things that you can do to make that more visible. I think the other part is also to constantly keep defining and redefining what your context is and who your, end learners are. Because I feel like over time that also keeps changing. So context is not stationary. It will keep changing over time. And to almost recognize that the fact that it is going to be dynamic is kind of another thing to sort of, keep in mind.
Yeah. Is there any advice for people on how they can keep up with changing context? Because I do agree it's easy to get into this idea of you've defined what the context is, and before you know it, a bunch of stuff has changed in the company without you noticing it, and the context has shifted while you haven't been able to keep pace with it. So any thoughts on how we can really keep an eye on that as it changes and evolves over time?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think as you're designing different kinds of experiences, a good exercise that I've found to do at the very beginning is kind of define what are the constraints that we're working within. Now, those constraints could be behaviors that we've seen, they could be time available, they could be other patterns that we found in the context, or like ecosystem trends, etc. But almost have a list of that at the beginning of every project, and as a kind of horizontal exercise across different courses that you might be designing or different experiences that you design, you can almost keep tweaking that larger kind of contextual understanding that you have. And if there are different people that are working on different types of courses and might be like understanding the context in their own way, a good exercise is also to find space to sort of come together, say a monthly cadence where you exchange notes and almost allow for that kind of cross learning within the company as well.
Again, you've got a really useful tool, which is this empathy map. So my last question for you is actually, as part of this as well, just building your own skill of empathy so you can build a better understanding with people. And therefore, it's far easier to notice changes. It's far easier to understand context if you're empathetic to your end user or your learner.
Yeah, I think I like to summarize it in, again, like one line: first who, then what. And if we just remember that, then I think everything else will kind of fall into place.
Awesome. We have got a minute or two. So if anyone's got any questions for Srishti, please drop them in the chat now. As you may have or not guessed, I'm very curious about this topic, so I've got lots of questions for Srishti, but I would love to hear if anyone else has got one. Here we go. One from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Can you give an example of applying these principles to a real life project you've worked on? Maybe without giving away any sensitive information you can't, but how has this translated to any work you've done before, Srishti?
Yeah, so interestingly, the article that you see is actually almost like a synthesis of a project that I was working on. So all the tools and frameworks that you see in the article was actually something that was a part of a report that we did for a project before we actually got into designing the program. So just a little bit of context, we were working on a program which had been around for the last 10 years, right? And obviously in those 10 years, there were a lot of different team members that had worked on that program. There were a lot of different kind of understanding of who the program is for, what is it doing, where is it failing. And one of the first things that we did was actually put out all those things that you see as part of the article by talking to learners, talking to trainers, talking to different people within the organization as well. And that really helped everybody sort of get on the same page and have a common kind of language when they spoke about the program and the context.
Awesome.
So yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah,
Sarah.
definitely. We'll take one final question from Gillian. She asked about if you have a framework for the empathy scale. In the article, it's more of a map, isn't it? It's made up of the different elements like thinking, feeling, saying, and doing. So yeah, any final thoughts on that map as a framework people can use?
So the empathy map is almost a way to synthesize what you know. Now you can do that, say, if everybody in the room already understands your learners or the stakeholder that you're building the empathy map for, you can almost do that as a collective exercise. It's almost like, it's really good to kind of have that debate and discussion. A good way to also do that is also, say, talk to learners and have that as a result of those conversations, right? So the idea is to arrive at an empathy map after talking to 10 different types of learners. So that's another way in which that's useful. Empathy map is quite a popular kind of tool in the user research world. So you'll find, I'm sure, a lot more like ways to use it if you just search for it online as well.
Cool. Brilliant. Thank you, Srishti. Like I said, if you have any more questions, do drop them in the chat. We missed one that we couldn't get to, but if there are any more on this topic, drop them in. I will try and consolidate them at the end and see if we can put together some more insights. But Srishti, like I said, there's links to connect with you, your newsletter, and this great article in the chat. So please do check them out. If you're listening to the recording of this, they'll just be in the show notes and the description for you to go and check them out as well. So Srishti, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. I can't believe it. We're doing well for time, which is normally my terrible part of the process. But Rob, you're going to give us some great insights on how we can use the right language as we build out our learning experiences. But before all that, like Srishti, just give us an insight into who you are and what it is that you do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob. I'm from Cancer Research UK. Really nice to meet you all. Basically, my role is split into two parts. So I create, design, deliver digital learning content. And then the other half of my role is to campaign our learning offers across CI UK more generally. Previously, I worked in the NHS. Before that, I was at Apple. So I've done a few different L&D roles and been in a few different functions. But the thing that I'm sort of most inspired by is writing, engaging, learning content and the mindset for that, really. So yeah, nice to meet you.
You've got the right audience here, because anyone who knows me loves that. Knows copywriting is my first love. So I'm really interested to hear you talk us through this. And the first thing is how you moved away from being passive in writing content, and any advice on how you did that other people can apply.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to say like why we changed at all. We captured data in a couple of ways, but one of the common things we found was that people know where to find our learning content. It's just when they're there, they're like, this doesn't actually feel very relevant to me. So that's why we changed from that more passive to more active content. So for us in a diverse organization made up of diverse roles, different levels of role, it was how do we give people tools in amongst that diversity and then give them the chance to like develop and grow. So the first thing we did was actually speak to our audience, like get to know them, who actually are our audience. But a sort of more smaller version of, or like a more acute example of that is we started addressing our audience as you through our content. I see so much learning content that refers to the learner, shall we say, as an individual. And I'll give you an example that I've done before, which is individuals that give constructive feedback are more likely to unblock challenges and learn from mistakes more regularly. An example of how we've changed that is the more constructive feedback you give, the more likely you are to unblock challenges and the problems that you face at work. That you makes such a massive difference to involving your audience. And then what you find is you're actually speaking to them. It's not someone else, it's not anecdotal, it's them. And that's so significant for unlocking your moving away from being passive, really. And then another sort of practical example of what we've done to move away from being passive is to actually give people things to do. Most of our content is consumed by people when they're at work, like they're sort of at their computer doing their job. So it makes sense for people to kind of learn that way as well, in all honesty. It's about creating the place that your audience are going to, or your people are going to take something tangible away and do something that day, not like a hypothetical situation that might happen in a month's time, but something that they can do that day or that week or that afternoon, something like that. So for us, it's about changing the structure of how we structure any form of content, whether that's written, video, what have you. Instead, it's going from something that's like consume it, consume it, consume it, consume it, consume a bit more, then consume a bit more, and now right, go give this a go. The way that we've changed it is that our content involves people much more quickly, so that you consume a little bit of information, right, now go try this now, consume a bit more, right, go try this now and give this a go and reflect in these ways. So it's about having practical tools that people can use through the work that they do. And that's where the real development happens then on the job, rather than what they're consuming in that moment. So yeah, it's just a way of making content less static, really, but in a way that's realistic, time fair, safe, to try those things without it feeling overwhelming, really. So you're involving people much more quickly by addressing them and by giving them something to do.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. It's really interesting because we're moving into this era of skimmable content. People want to read short sentences that build up. And actually, I feel that framing of moving to you really allows you to do that, because you can connect to the pain point straight away. You know, like if you're struggling to add people to the system, it can feel like a burden. Or as opposed to when people struggle to add learners to the system, that framing is just such a nice, natural way to write about the pain point. So I really love that. And actually, I think it also helps with the next question I wanted to ask you, because when we spoke before, you said that a lot of content can be very broad and wordy, which stops it telling a compelling story. So I'd love to hear your advice on how we avoid doing this big word dump into our content, and how we can actually make sure it does tell a more resonating story, I guess.
Yeah, well, again, I think the key word is story. That's the thing to unlock, and something I feel really strongly about in any learning content is that it's really easy to get caught in telling the entire spectrum of a subject. I've seen so many resources that like basically collects content from loads of different places. So like maybe a Harvard Business Review article here, an article here, a video here, a few more videos, some more articles. and it doesn't really tell the story of what you want. So all of that might have been about stakeholder management, for instance, but it doesn't really give you what your audience wants to know about stakeholder management. It just sort of collects resources about it. It just fills some space with good stuff, some all right stuff, and some sort of frankly irrelevant stuff. So taking an example of where we are, we have a learning plan on emotional intelligence, and it's primarily aimed at managers leading teams for emotional intelligence. And I think that it would be really easy to get caught into making a really deep research into emotional intelligence, the psychology behind it, etc. And that just kind of isn't useful for our audience. Our managers kind of want to know, how do I lead a better team and how do I be more there for them? So it's much more focused on giving those tools in a way that best supports team members. So for example, this particular learning plan around emotional intelligence has, how do you build your self-awareness? Here's an exercise to practice regulating your emotions. Here's what empathy looks like, and here's how you practice it. So it's audience focused, but what you're doing is you're telling the story that they need. And what that does is allows you to sort of tackle the broadness of it, and is much more specific to what people actually want and need to think differently in their role, to be there for team members, whatever that particular thing is. And another thing, and you kind of referenced it actually in the question, is I think there's a tendency in learning and development, and I'm guilty of this, is to kind of show off like how much we know about a subject. It's not our job to provide people with like an abundance of knowledge, and it's not our job to show people how much we know about a subject. Is to give them what they need to feel more confident at work, make better decisions, and get to kind of where they want to be, whether that's career related or what have you. So I think it's always about asking yourself, how are you going to set this thing up? How are you going to bring that to life, and how are you going to wrap it up? And that allows you to be less overly wordy. And you'll see, as soon as you start to approach your content as a story, the words just drop off. Like, you don't feel the need to fill it up with information, because what you're doing is you're sort of going for a cone almost of like getting more and more specific. So I guess in some ways it's thinking like a copywriter, and how do we tell that story as clearly and as almost as quickly as we can. So yeah,
that is really useful advice. I have two simple rules for copywriting. One is, the goal is not for me to sound smart, it's for people to understand, and that is a nice North Star for not dumping in everything I know. And the story part is like, what's the end state and what's the problem state? You know, how do we move someone from problem state to goal state? And if your copy just focuses on those two ends of the journey, then you will tell a much better story. So much of that really resonates with me. Any final thoughts on how we connect with people on a more personal level in our content?
Yeah, in some ways I've just referenced actually that, and because this is a journey that I'm always on, it's like connecting with people, particularly when you work organizationally, where people are all over the place and working in different roles, diverse. I think that there's the trap that we can fall into, that we've got to prove our worth in learning and development, and that can be like a real blocker for me and for other people working in learning and development. And I see loads of content where it tries to be overly eloquent and gets like really excited by its own message. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to be clear, and for it not to be kind of poetic. In the end, when doing that, it sort of can become a bit more confusing and a bit pretentious. And I fall into that. I have to stop myself from falling into that trap and be like, how do I make this as clear as it possibly can be? That's what people are looking for, right? Is tools to do things differently or their job better or what have you. So I guess it's starting with and ending with this in mind, is what do you want the person who's watching or consuming this to get out of it? Like, what is the end goal? And that step happens before you've written it as well. But when you are writing it, always having that in your mind is like, what do I want someone to get out of this? And remember that people at work don't have an abundance of time. They want to be engaged really quickly and get to where they want to be quickly. So that kind of speaks to what we said before about storytelling and copywriting, is getting there as quickly as you can. But that's driven by your audience. What do they actually need? One trap that I've fallen in a few times as well is that I sometimes think that people care the same amount that I do about learning, which they don't. People want tools and solutions to complex problems, and our role is to enable that. So we shouldn't really be trying to convert them into the way that we think. Our goal, first and foremost, is providing them with tools. And I think that it's a mindset thing. It's how do you get yourself into a space where you actually know what people want? And some real quick wins to do that is to avoid fluff and jargon. And remember that people aren't reading, watching, listening to our content because they want to be wowed by how much we know, as I said before. So it's not about oversimplification to the point that what you're doing is a bit like, meh, what's it trying to do? I think it's just finding the balance, and writing snappier sentences that cut straight to the point. Those sorts of things will be much more useful to the people that actually like consume your learning material. And I think to end on that is like one thing that I learned a lot from is taking a marketing like mindset into the way that we campaign our learning offers. But I think it applies really to the content as well. It's the same principles that going down to what is in it for me. And that mindset is like, I think, the key that kind of makes it easier to make engaging content, because you're actually then engaging who wants to be engaged. So yeah, that's my final thought, I suppose.
No, I agree. If you can't answer what's in it for me, then the end user probably can't get the benefit from it. Just one final question from me, actually. I know that when I speak to a lot of people who want to unpick this habit of maybe like using too many words in their content or trying to be snappier, have you found that it's just got easier over time and the competence and confidence has kind of built up as you've done it more and more?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I've basically got two things that I've done and that I found useful. The first is time, and time and confidence to kind of trim down what you say or write, without feeling like I've not done enough. And it's telling yourself that you have done enough. But time is the thing that builds that confidence, that when you get like that real-time feedback or the confidence that you're just doing it right, it's very hard to build that. So time does, but I think it's really like time to build confidence. The second is just speaking or working with a copywriter, someone that's like bold enough to just go, no, get rid of that, no, get rid of that, no, get rid of that. It's a really good process to go through, because it builds your mindset, but I think you just gain a bit of confidence to be a bit more brutal and change the message. But for me, it was working with a copywriter that kind of gave me that enablement to do it.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. One good piece of advice for people is it's often hard to be super critical or objective about your own copy. So go and find a blog post you don't think is written particularly well and rewrite it with some of Rob's advice, and, strip back the stuff that's unnecessary. Try and front load all of the value, make it engaging, short and snappy, and really try and make sure the problem that it solves is really clear. So yeah, it's really hard to edit your own copy, but go and find someone else's and be brutal to them, and then you can move it over to you. Rob, that's some great advice. I can see some nice feedback in the chat about it as well. So please do connect with Rob on LinkedIn. I've dropped his link in the chat, and I really appreciate you joining us, Rob.
No, thank you. And thank you everyone for your time.
Perfect. I can't believe it. We're still on time. I've missed my calling in life as a timekeeper somewhere. So Meghan, hopefully you're here with us as well.
Hey, good morning.
Morning, Meghan. How are you?
Wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for joining us earlier over in the US, aren't you? So this is early in the morning for you.
This is the one time the time change actually played in my favor. So instead of 6, it turned to 7. So we're doing okay.
The planets aligned. Cool. Meghan, you're going to share some great advice with us on understanding your culture, your learners, and how we can keep them engaged. But as with our other two guests so far, just give us a bit of an intro into who you are and what it is that you do.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Meghan, and I have spent most of my career in learning and development. So for about 18 years, I worked for the Walt Disney Company. I started as a facilitator, moved into technical writing, and then instructional design and project management. Wonderful time, lots of great stories from that experience. And then within the last 2 years, I took a huge career leap, moved over to a cybersecurity company named CrowdStrike, and now I am the employee development manager for that company. And it's been a wonderful stretch of my skills to now not just focus on coming in and triaging singular problems, but I oversee the whole experience, from onboarding through when maybe they become leaders. So I focus mostly on professional development for our engineers, sales, and all sorts of folks.
Nice. I bet that was a really interesting and challenging shift at the start.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I suppose one of the things you did at the start was try and understand the culture, which leads us nicely into how do we then bring our organizational culture into learning experiences that we create, and any advice for people on how they can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start by defining culture, because I think sometimes when we start this conversation of culture, we immediately go to geographic location. And yes, absolutely, there's country culture and things like that. When I'm talking about culture, I'm really talking about the norms that are associated with a group of people, right? So that could be things like symbols and language and celebrations and artifacts and all those pieces and parts. So when we think about culture, I was taking notes earlier. So Srishti, this is in your little concentric circles, right? This is the organizational part of it. And Rob, the language absolutely plays a huge part of it. But the reason I want to focus on culture is because it helps make your training relevant, right? So we can go purchase lots of off-the-shelf stuff and offer it to people, but it is a hard transition for folks to go, this is great. How do I make this happen in my role? So citing from my personal experience, I went from the Walt Disney Company, right, whose mission is storytelling and inspiration for folks around the world, to a cybersecurity company where it's we stop breaches. First and foremost, we are good guys versus bad guys. We're on the front lines. And there's some overlap there and what they value. They highly focused on customers, highly focused on innovative services. But the way that those play out in the business are wildly different, right? So when you start developing for an organization, yes, we want to look at the learner and the who and the why, and the culture plays into that context. So understanding, what is the company mission, vision, values? What things do they prioritize in their people that helps drive their behavior? If you think about the language that folks use, Gary, you brought up the great point about pain, right? So in my prior role, feelings were very big in that culture. We talked a lot about what people felt when they went to the movies, what they felt when they went to the parks. Don't really talk about feelings in the cybersecurity space, talk about pain. Okay, so it's a very similar concepts, but the way that you explain them comes across very differently. And if you're not quite sure what your culture is, definitely look to the leaders of the organization, how they put themselves out in branding and marketing, but also compare yourself to folks outside of your space. I didn't realize how unique culture was until I left. Similarly, you may not understand how, like, if you think about it again from a geographic perspective, you may not understand how your own culture shapes you until you travel to a different country. So just continue to kind of compare what's going on in your world with what's happening in the worlds of others.
That really resonates with me, because before I worked at How Now, I worked in 2 different travel companies, and one was just about like fun family holidays. One was about travel data, and the tone of voice internally, the culture, like very much aligned to the mission and the vision of the company. One was about aspirational, get your family together. The other one was kind of like hard and fast numbers. No, we can't have any fun with this kind of coffee. So, yeah, it is crazy how drastic that can be. Another thing, though, you mentioned context there and defining what culture is. You also made a great point to me before that we need to define what engaging means in our company as well, in terms of the context. It's kind of an easy catch-all term to use, but actually, do we understand what engagement looks like in the context of our company?
Thank you for bringing that up. I was like ready to bring out my little soapbox. So coming from a design background, I don't know if any of y'all feel the same way. I freak out when I hear the word engaging, because it is such a biased term and it's really hard to measure. And we've done it to ourselves, right? Like we kind of put out there, training should be engaging, should be this and that. But what I have found in consulting with various business leaders is that engaging just means I don't want a bad level 1. I don't want people to say this was boring. I don't want low metrics, whatever that looks like. So whenever I hear a client say, hey, I want this to be engaging, that's kind of my cue to roll up my sleeves and dig in a little deeper. Okay, so help me understand, what does engaging look like for you? And I just want to be clear, not everything needs to be a 3-act play with fireworks and musical numbers, right? I love my musicals, but sometimes it's not always appropriate for what's going on, right? So, in the culture that I work in now, time time is everything. It's about what can I get the quickest and implement the fastest. So when I think of what's going to service my employees in the best way possible, it's short, it's fast, it's searchable, it's bookmarkable. Now, to other cultures, that might be like, "Oh, that's boring, that's black and white, that's this." And it might be. And again, you weren't the target audience for this. This is the target audience for this. So I think, again, thinking about the who and the why and the context and the language, you really got to look at that whole organizational piece and understand, what do they need? How fast do they need to get it? Or is it more of we need more time to think through these things? And so does a program make more sense to give them the time and the space to reflect and think and drive that behavior change? So yeah, I think just looking deeper into the question of I want some, or the request, I want something engaging, will really help drive what that looks like for that organization.
Yeah, no, I love that point around, is it bookmarkable and easy to find? Because it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking engaging means I need to add loads of bells and whistles to a piece of content. But what if people just want like 5 bullet points that they can pull up really easily often? So I completely agree with that point.
So I'll share a quick story with
Yeah.
y'all. So I distinctly remember a client asking, they had a compliance training and they wanted it to be engaging, right? And so this was my first cue into like how you need to dig deeper into this. And so a peer of mine worked tirelessly to put all the bells and whistles into this compliance training. I mean, like pop-up videos, it was beautiful. Presented it to the client and the client was mortified. Like, how could you make a mockery of my compliance training? And it was because engaging to them meant they read it. They engaged with the content and could sign off on it. The stuff, it was a happy ending, and at the end they figured it out. But that was my first cue into like, oh, not everybody perceives this the way that I perceive it, and I need to ask more questions before going into a project.
Yeah, perfect validation for some of what Srishti and Rob mentioned about knowing what the contextual pain points are, and like you said, the kind of cultural norms as well. When we spoke before as well, you told me this really interesting thing about stuff L&D can learn from industries like party planners and gyms, for example, about keeping people engaged over time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it may sound silly, but now that I own the experience start to finish, from the first invitation through graduation and alumni engagement. I know I just said I don't like that word, but keeping our alumni close in hand, I've had to look outside, right? And figure out, how do you keep people happy, wanting to come back, wanting to be a part of this group? And so I would encourage you all to look in your communities, look at things that you subscribe to, that you're a part of, that you keep coming back time and time again. What about it makes you feel special? What about it makes you feel valued? What about it makes you feel like it's value for the time and money that you're putting into it, right? So when Gary and I were talking, we're like, for those who actually go to the gym with your gym subscriptions, right? I think we were talking about this in January. What is it about that experience that makes you keep going back? If you subscribe to streaming services, what about it makes you keep going back? Is it the new content? Is it the marketing campaigns? What is it about those different things? And so as L&D professionals, look at the trends that are happening around you and figure out how you can adapt those into your broader experiences, not just from the moment your participants start the Zoom call, but what does that communication look like before? What does it look like after? How do you keep them excited about what's coming next?
100%. There's a nice overlap actually that I've only just realized now between what you said and what Rob said. But, if we define what engaging means, we can use better language internally that resonates with people. I find this all the time, having to check myself from putting like better into podcast titles, blog posts. Like, how do you make a better learning experience, or how do you create a more engaging content strategy? It's like, are these fluffy words, can they actually be more quantifiable? If they are more quantifiable, you can tell a better story to the internal stakeholders about the impact you can potentially have.
Absolutely. The more that you can define what your outcomes of your training will be, the less ambiguity there is, and you're able to tell that better story.
One final question from me. How important is it that we remember there is a person at the end of the learning experience?
Absolutely. So I think this goes back to Srishti's empathy piece of it, right? Most people come to learning in a time of change. And If you want to raise your hand with a Zoom emoji. I don't know how many of you react well to change, but statistically, most people don't do well with change. So whether it's they're coming in because a software is being updated, right? That means their day-to-day job is changing. I have the privilege of running a Toastmasters club within CrowdStrike. Most people come to that group because they lack self-confidence in their public speaking, and we want to create that safe environment for them to grow. Or maybe they're in a leadership training and this is the first time ever that they've had to lead people, maybe even lead people on the same team they're previously part of. So taking all that into consideration, training ultimately is a very vulnerable space for people to walk into. And I think Rob kind of touched on this a little bit. Sometimes we come into that space as L&D professionals, look at all I know, look at all these amazing things. And we got to pause and go, this person might be scared. This person might be uneasy. This person might be angry, right? That their whole world is changing and they're being put into this training. So just always keep that in mind, that there are emotions from our participants on the other end, and anything you can do as part of that overall experience, understanding the culture, understanding the context of what's happening to address that before you ever step into content will help smooth that runway for you to make sure that learning lands the way it needs to.
Yeah, I love that vulnerability piece, because we often might see that for one person, a learning experience is a bunch of really small steps to incrementally improve over time. The Toastmasters one actually is a great example, because I was there yesterday. Someone came along and like even just getting up to introduce who they were and why they were there was such a big challenge for them. And they just needed that support, that empathy for people to be really considerate of that. And, if you try and just fast track them to the solution or the end state super quickly, you will probably create a bad experience from over the course of it. So I love that advice on vulnerability.
Excellent. Go Toastmasters.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, no one, if you've joined before, I don't need any encouragement to talk about Toastmasters to people. I would highly recommend it if anyone does have any confidence issues, or you just want to get better at speaking in front of people. I'd 100% recommend it. Meghan, was there anything we didn't go over just then around bringing culture into learning experiences you'd like to share?
No, I think we covered everything, and you're still on time, so you're rocking it today.
God, I am sharp. I'm dialed in. In that case, then, I will just remind everyone to connect with Meghan. I dropped your LinkedIn in the chat, so please do go and connect with Meghan now. Meghan, massive thank you for joining us. Cool. We should have one last guest ready to join us. Bena, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. How are you doing, Bena? You okay?
Good, good.
Perfect. So we're going to actually go through something that overlaps, I think, with everything that everyone else has shared so far, and it'll give a really nice framework for how to get a root cause analysis done. But before we get into that, do tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is you do, Bena.
So I'm a learning and development specialist. I have a background in education. I'm a master in education, and I've transitioned into corporate L&D. I create effective L&D strategies that address the pain points of the organization. And I achieve this by starting my projects with a root cause analysis. I ask good questions, keep an open mind to new and novel training solutions.
Perfect. We are getting a little bit of echo, just to let you know, Bena, from your microphone, but hopefully it will pass. So if we want to make learning experiences personal and engaging, we need to understand the problems and motivations. So talk us through that first step. Why is it so crucial that we understand people's motivations and what's critical to them when we build out learning experiences?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that the previous three guests made some really good points about taking into account the learner's ecosystem and culture, using the right language. I believe that when we are working in a corporate environment, it's essential to go a step further and link the training program we are trying to solve, training to the problem that we're trying to solve. I know a lot of instructional designers transition from the teaching field. And if you are transitioning to corporate instructional designing, it's important to understand that unlike children and teenagers, adults are motivated by different factors. No matter how thoroughly you have analyzed the learner's profile, the learner is going to be reluctant to engage in your training if they can't see the point of it, if they can't see how it is addressing their needs or solving a specific problem they're facing in their roles. Adult learners are more committed to their training when they see what the problem looks like. when they see what metrics their performance is falling behind on and how investing their valuable time in training is going to pay off on those metrics. This is why it's important for instructional designers that work in corporate world to start with problem discovery process and conduct a thorough root cause analysis before even diving into creating content. It's also useful to set training goals that are specific and measurable. I'll give you an example. So a vague goal would be something like improve customer service skills. And a more precise goal, on the other hand, would be something like enhance customer satisfaction by reaching first call resolution rate of 70% within 6 months. So sharing specific and measurable goals with the employees helps them develop a sense of ownership and responsibility to improve performance as a team collectively. It gives them a sense of being part of a team that collectively shares the responsibility to improve performance.
Yeah, I really like that framing because some people aren't even aware they've got a problem a lot of the time. So until you quantify it with the metrics that need to be moved, the real severity or the potential impact or improvement of those metrics, then you won't necessarily get 100% buy-in or a higher level of buy-in. So take us through this idea of the root cause analysis, because this is how we can tick those boxes that you just mentioned, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a practical and helpful method of doing a root cause analysis. I'll just briefly explain it here. So you start by asking your clients good questions. How did you realize that this problem exists? What are you measuring right now that tells you that this is a problem? What should the metrics on this measurement look like ideally? How will you know that you have successfully solved this problem? What will things look like in the next 6 or 12 months when we have solved the problem? How long do we have before this problem becomes too painful? This last question is very important to convey a sense of urgency and get more buy-in. Let's take the example of poor customer service. So your questions would look something like this. How did you realize that there is a problem with your staff's customer service skills? Was it number of refunds? Was it number of canceled subscriptions or increase in complaints? How will you know that you have solved this issue with lack of customer service skills? Is it increase in renewals, fewer number of complaints? With the help of these questions, you can uncover what the performance looks like currently and what it should look like ideally, revealing the gap between its current state and the ideal state, and that gap is the problem that you're dealing with. Next, you identify the problem area. Now, the problem area need not necessarily be a physical department. It could extend to aspects such as work culture or attitudes. So with our example of customer service skills, the problem area could be anything from inadequate training programs, or maybe it's unclear service protocols. Maybe it's disengaged employees or a lack of emphasis on customer satisfaction as a company value. So once you've pinpointed the problem area, you trace the symptoms, and until you cover the root cause, you'll recognize that you found the root cause when you hit a dead end, with all the symptoms originating from the central issue. And the last thing is share your findings with your employees. Remember, this is going to be a team effort. Explain to them what the root cause of the poor customer service is. Set a goal with them to improve the numbers. Give them the trainings that they need and aim to improve those numbers within a certain timeline. When you share your findings, you create a sense of collective responsibility and team membership.
Yeah, there's two things I really love in there. One is just those two questions alone can be really helpful. How did you know this was a problem? How will you know if we've solved the problem? That is such a easy way to just get a gauge on what the problem is. And sharing the findings is an interesting one, actually. I hadn't thought about that, but I can imagine that a lot of the time teams internally, like I mentioned earlier, it can be a challenge to be objective. So maybe you haven't done that really critical analysis of your own process that's leading to a particular metric. So maybe you do need someone like your L&D team to come in, go through this root cause analysis with you, and then present the findings back to you and the wider business. So I really like this idea and this framing. Lastly, when we spoke before, you gave me this great insight into how you can tap into new ideas and adopt the right mindset to bring those into your learning experiences to solve those root cause problems. So yeah, tell us about this.
I actually watched a very interesting social experiment that I want to share here. So it's an experiment on social conformity where there is a waiting room, waiting room for shortlisted applicants for an interview. And the experiment starts with 3 actors in the room that have been briefed to stand and sit every time a bell rings. They bring a genuine shortlisted applicant to the room, and then the bell rings, and all the 3 actors stand up, and then the bell rings again, and they all sit down. And although the applicant finds this behavior odd because everybody else is doing it, they simply follow. So they gradually bring more genuine applicants to the waiting room one at a time, and they all sit and stand together when the bell rings. Eventually, the room is full of genuine applicants, and the 3 actors leave the room. And what happens when the bell rings? All the genuine applicants, they all stand up and they sit down. And now I don't think we should encourage blindly following the crowd. That's not the message here. But social conformity can be a useful tool in our workplace learning and development endeavors. We can use this principle to our advantage, isn't it? L&D professionals can leverage this by creating a culture where everybody is committed to their personal and professional growth and development. And then when new employees join in, they are likely to conform to this culture. It's more of a preventative strategy than a solution. Yeah.
No, I love that. It's so interesting how often will people really nail the part where they discover the problems and then they just do the tried and trusted thing they've done before rather than going, is there a new way to solve this problem? So I really love that advice as well. I dropped a link in the chat, Bena, to the root cause analysis blog post that you shared with me, so people can go check out a longer form version of what Bena has shared with us there. But other than that, Bena, I just want to say a massive thank you for joining us and sharing that great advice.
Thank you.
Perfect. So we did it, everyone. We are on time. We've covered all of this great advice, and I can see there was some great engagement in the chat. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today.